Hello, everyone, and welcome to a conversation on who is a liberal and what is a liberal political system. I have with me three friends who I've known for a long time. Gurcharan Das, who's the author of The Dilemma of an Indian Liberal. He also is the former chairperson of the Center for Civil Society. I also have Mohandas Pai, who is a venture capitalist based in Bangalore and the chairman of RN Capital Partners. And we have Parth Shah, the dean and co-founder of the Indian School of Public Policy and the founder of the Center for Civil Society. I've known each of these people, gentlemen, for many years, and they've been influential in my journey also as a liberal. So we're here to spend some time talking about liberalism. And maybe before as a way to warm up to what we want to talk about, let's actually talk about what it means to you being a liberal. How do you define liberalism? Who is a liberal? Why is liberalism relevant for India? Gurcharan, I'd like you to start us, please.
Well, I think that a liberal is a person who is tolerant, open-minded, respects the views of others, and is willing to change his mind. When it comes to that's the individual, but when it comes to the society or a nation, liberal is a person who respects the rule of law, is committed to democracy and market outcomes rather than bureaucratic outcomes. But I think most of all, a liberal is wary of all forms of power, whether it's state power, whether it's religious power, whether it's military power, or whether it's economic power. As far as this, the confusion arises because many people, it's a very frustrating word, and people are, liberals come in various shades. The big difference is a person like me, I regard as a classical liberal, and this is, I have described what a classical liberal is. But there are also people who are left liberals. Now, left liberals were the earlier late 19th century, early 20th century progressives. They are also former Marxists. And so what they have, their social agenda is pretty much the same as the classical liberals, but their economic agenda is different because they are quite happy to turn power over to the state to solve the problems of generally their worry is equality. And the difference, I would say, between a classical liberal and left liberal is a classical liberal puts freedom over equality. The left liberal places equality over freedom. So that is the difference. There is also libertarian, which is a cousin of liberals. Libertarian is a more extreme form of the freedom-loving liberal, and the person who is most wary of the state, and who believes that who believes in what is called the night watchman state, the chokidar state, as we would say in India, where he or she would restrict the role of the role of government to basically law and order. And then it puts a very high obstacle for giving the state more power than beyond law and order. So I have defined a liberal, a classic difference between a classical liberal and left liberal and a libertarian. There's also a neoliberal. Now, a neoliberal is close to a classical liberal, except the neoliberals came up in the late 1980s and 90s with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And they came up actually as a reaction to the excessiveness of the welfare state, where states, many countries, could not afford the kind of welfare state that had been created, and they went back to the basics in terms of redefining the role of the market and the state. So I guess that's what I would say is the definition of a liberal.
Gurcharan, why is it relevant to India?
Well, it was most relevant to India in because in the first 40 years of our life as a nation was a country which gave the most amazing freedom to its people. It gave religious freedom, freedom of speech, political freedom, all forms of freedom, except it denied them economic freedom. And therefore, the Swatantra Party rose up in the 60s, late 50s, early 60s, as a response to that. And what we, in order to, there was a fair amount of correction from the 1990s when the economic reforms took place, and it certainly the relevance of liberals was obvious to everyone, and of course India's economic growth story began at that time. However, the relevance is equally important today because India has risen economically, but India is also a land of ironies, which is to say that, when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s and 70s, we, we were a proud liberal democracy, which was saddled with a statist socialist economy that we call the license permit inspector Raj. Now, the irony here is that today we have a dynamic liberal economy, but our political our politics are turning illiberal. And so it's as important today as it was earlier in our history. And that's where I would say is the relevance of liberalism to India.
Thanks, Gurcharan. Mohan, you and I have spent a lot of time in Chicago, and actually that's where I was introduced to liberalism for the first time with my professor, George Stigler. Would love to hear you talk about your thoughts on what liberalism is and why it's relevant to India.
Thank you, Louis. I believe that liberalism is a political system based upon individual freedom and individual choice. The freedom of the individual is the most important right an individual can have in any society. For all of us, the most important asset we have is our life. We have only one life. And where is our life the safest? Our life is the safest not in a dictatorship, not in a benevolent dictatorship, not in a socialistic paradise, but in a political system governed by the rule of law based on liberal values. It's very important to understand that liberalism is a natural outcome of human society as it evolves over the ages, moving from the feudal order to possibly a socialistic order, finding traces of liberalism and moving to a truly liberal order where individual freedom and individual choice will prevail. What does individual freedom means? The political science about the social compact tells us that we are all born free as individuals. God has made us in his image, whoever that God is, and we are born as free people. And when you're born as free people, you live together in society. The innate rights that you have as a free person to do whatever you want is consolidated and given to your representatives to rule over you and create an orderly society which can protect your life, liberty, and property and ensure order under a set of rules called the rule of law. The rule of law will ensure that my rights and your rights, when they clash, there is an appropriate resolution as per predefined norms. So individual freedom is the biggest and most valuable right that we can cherish next to the right to life. And it's important for us to realize the potential as individuals. Individual freedom means the freedom of expression, where we can express our thoughts freely without restraint in orderly manner. We cannot be abusive. We cannot damage the reputation of others, for which we must exercise self-restraint, because a mature liberal will always have self-restraint in what they do. Liberalism means that you protect the rights of everybody. And as a liberal, your first duty is to make sure that you respect the right of everybody to express themselves and defend to the end the right to so express, rather than dominating them with your views. Dissent is very natural to a liberal and to a liberal political system, because dissent creates new ideas, dissent creates new viewpoints, and dissent takes society forward. So the freedom of expression is a very, very fundamental, dear right to a liberal in a liberal society. And the liberal society also gives you the right to reside in a place of your choice within your country, the right to freely travel, the right to exercise your profession, the right to live a life of quiet dignity. It also gives you the right of choice. What is the value of freedom if you don't have a choice? If you live in a totalitarian economy and they say that you have full freedom, but you don't have a choice, or the right to make a choice, or the availability of choices, then that is not a good liberal society. Now, the dilemma about choice is that there must be available choices for you to make. And the simplest example could be, do you have the choice of picking different courses of education that you would like? Do you have the choice of picking different professions that you like? Do you have the choice of working or not working? Do you have the choice of building relationship with people you like, etc.? So there must be availability of choices. So a liberal society has various choices available to you. Exercise a choice so that you can live life as per your needs and your desires, and to the fullest extent possible to realize your full potential. And in a liberal society, the most important thing is to exercise caution on the powers given to the state, because you do need a state. You can't be a liberal society in a state of anarchy where there's no governing power. You need to have a state. The state has to be ruled by people whom you elect periodically to represent you, and they must represent you to make sure that proper laws are made, proper laws are enforced, and there is no room for violence. As an individual, we have the right to violence to protect ourselves. We don't have the right to violence to destroy others, but the right to violence to defend ourselves. And in a liberal society where there is a state, the right to violence becomes the monopoly of the state, because the state takes on itself the ability to protect you and make sure that the strong do not prey on the weak. And if you do that, everybody will have a choice. Now, in a liberal society, the moot question comes, like Gurcharan says, how do we ensure that everybody has freedom, individual freedom, and everybody has the ability to make a choice? Now, individual freedom is largely a political issue. In most liberal societies, you have a written constitution which guarantees your right, like our Indian Constitution, which guarantees the right to equality, the right to justice, etc., and another chapter on fundamental rights. So rights are clearly defined, and the rights are sacrosanct. And the Supreme Court has said clearly that the chapter on fundamental rights is the basic structure of the Constitution and cannot be amended or deleted or reduced, which is a very, very important judgment to protect all of us from the tyranny of government and the tyranny of anybody who seems to be a superior power. So our freedoms are largely come from a political construct. Then there comes the question of choice. To make economic choices, you must be in a position to make the choices. How do you make economic choices when one person is extremely poor with no education, no skill, the other person is well educated, a third person is born to wealth, etc. And that's a fundamental dilemma which gives rise to political systems. Like Gurcharan himself said just now to explain, equality is a very important attribute of a liberal society. It says very clearly, no person is superior or inferior to another in a liberal society in the exercise of their rights. We cannot have superior rights for a few or the many, because then you become the ruling class and a very feudal system. And to have equal rights, you must have the ability to enjoy the equal rights, which can be there in politically. But when it comes to economic issues, you must have the wherewithal to be able to make the choice. And the wherewithal to make the choice may need the state to economically intervene in some manners to create a welfare state where people of lesser means are helped to make the right choices in a basic manner and in a higher manner, which is something that all liberals should accept and propagate, because you want to create a very egalitarian society where liberal values can flourish and there can be no victims economically, because a few people are able to use their talent or their skills or their ancestral wealth to advance faster than others. And that is where the important issue of justice comes. What is justice? Justice is a system whereby, I would say in the Indian context, the rule of dharma shall prevail. Dharma, in my mind, is the duty to take care of society in all its various manifests, to make sure that justice for all, to make sure the weakest of the weak is given justice and has the right to live a life of quiet dignity, where there is no want and the basic necessities of life are available to all. Because we must remember, to further the interests of society, we must invest in our future generations. And in every young child should have the ability to dream and realize his or her dreams. And that means that the state or the liberal state or a welfare state should intervene to make economic conditions available. So normally a liberal society will have free education for children, maybe free education for children to college, free healthcare, and the basic necessities to make sure that you're able to make those choices. And this, to my mind, is extremely important. Now comes the fundamental question, who is a liberal? A liberal is a person who believes in the liberal values, the rights of every person, the right to equality, the right to justice, the right to a fair economic system without having too much of dogma or the state dominating, and a balance between everybody's rights. And the liberals should defend to the end the right of others to make their own choices and to exercise their freedom, howsoever repugnant to the senses it could be. And that's the choice that we have to consciously make. Are all societies liberal? No. Liberalism is a journey, it's an evolution. We're still far away from being a true liberal society. Every country has got a place. Every democracy, liberal democracy, has got a place. When India became free and gave to ourselves a constitution, it said very clearly, we the people of India. That means we gave to ourselves a constitution which promised all these liberal values. As India, given the liberal values to all its citizens, enjoyed them the benefits of individual freedom and individual choice, largely, but not fully, not substantially, as it is an evolution. As Gurcharan said again, we were born a free but poor nation. In a poor nation, it's not given to everybody to enjoy the fruits of individual freedom and individual choice. So there has to be many interventions that all of us, the society, have to make So India is work in progress like every other country in the world, and we can't be too critical. But the basic ingredients of a liberal society is there in India in our constitution and in our culture and in the rule of dharma in our society. And I hark to dharma because dharma is very unique to Indian society and Indian civilization. Because our forefathers believe that is the rule of dharma lies the salvation for a liberal order. And when dharma is in peril, we should fight against adharma to establish the rule of dharma. And that is what the story of the Mahabharata and Ramayana is. Great epics which teach you what happens if a liberal order is overtaken by tyranny. What happens if the strong try to prevail over the weak and the just? What happens if there's a disproportionate exercise of power? And that's the time when you must stand up. Being a liberal doesn't mean that you don't have violence. No, you give your right to violence to the state, and you have a duty to defend your liberal values and your dharma in the Indian context whenever adharma prevails. So I think this is what I think is a liberal. This is what I think is a liberal political order. And I think in India is work in progress. All of us have to strive to achieve it for a very important reason. The protection of life, liberty, and property is incumbent upon the establishment of a liberal order and the rule of law. Where the rule of law is weak, liberalism shall fail, and we cannot be protectors. For each of us to enjoy the fruits of freedom and the right to make a choice, we have to work together to establish this order where the state shall exercise power as per a mandate, nothing more and nothing less.
Thank you, Mohan. And there are a few words that we sort of come up with, with Gurcharan and Mohan. Words like rule of law, economic dynamism, freedom, choice, the constitution. And Gurcharan, I'm going to come back to you later on to talk a bit more about the fact that we have economic dynamism and how do we sort of handle the political liberalism. And Mohan, I'm going to come back to you about some of your thoughts on the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and why is liberalism steeped in Indian history, and what do we learn from that? But before that, I'm going to go to Parth, my old dear friend, who and I keep joking, I spend more time with, the only person I spend more time with Parth is my wife here, and we sort of joined at the hip through the Center for Civil Society and then the Indian School of Public Policy. And my sort of go-to person when I'm learning anything in this space. So, Parth, you recently were awarded by the Atlas Network Champion of Liberty and Freedom Award for the work that you've been doing in India. How do you define liberalism, and why is it relevant to India? Parth, you're on mute.
Thank you, Louis. I think my wife also says the same thing. So I think we both are in the same situation. To me, I think what Gurcharan and Mohandas also described quite well, a liberal society or a liberal state would be the one where every individual leads a life of choice and every institution is accountable, right? So I think choice is obviously a very important part, and Mohandas actually explained that in a lot of detail, what is meant by choice, right? And secondly, what he referred to as rule of law is what I refer to as being accountable institutions. So where your institutions, which are private or public, if they're all accountable to the larger society, then you have a rule of law in that society. So I think if you focus on where individuals lead a life of choice and where institutions are accountable, to me, that describes a liberal society, a liberal state, whichever you want to define it. Now, who is a liberal? I think that, in my view, Gandhiji is the quintessential liberal. And I think his basic premise of non-violence is also the basic axiom of liberalism. You first of all give up your right to violence, right to aggression, right? And as Mohandas pointed out, you sort of give that right to the state to implement on your behalf. And I think non-violence to me is the basic premise of a liberal. Now, you may say that, everybody is non-violent. Who is going to be in favor of violence? But if you think through a little bit, in most other ideologies, at the end of the day, come to violence as a way to enforce their ideal, as a way to enforce what they believe is a good thing for society, good thing for human beings, right? So start with Marxism or communism, right? No matter what they say about freedom and choice in their constitutions, but at the end of the day, violence is the one that prevails and decides how the society and life would work under that system, right? You go to the other end, fascism or a right-wing sort of dictatorial systems, which is also based on violence, right? So almost every other ideology, it may begin very simply, but at the end of the day, they all end up in a situation of violence. They all use violence to enforce what they believe is the right thing. And that's exactly what the liberal doesn't espouse. Liberal believes that violence has no role to play in any human interaction, right? And I think that's really, to me, is a foundation of liberalism. Now, as I said, Gandhi is the quintessential liberal. And I think if you look at liberalism in three different dimensions, so I think Gurcharan talked about economic dimension, a political dimension, and a personal dimension, right? So there are three types of freedoms: economic freedom, political freedom, and personal freedom. And all three are obviously very important for a liberal, right? And in my view, if you look at the Indian history, which is, I think, even before we go to Mahabharata and Ramayana, in even modern history, we have examples of individuals who lived their life according to these three different beliefs in freedoms, right? So, for example, Gandhi to me is a sort of archetypical political freedom champion. He was almost an anarchist. He did not believe in the large state, did not believe in the state at all in many cases. He was always very skeptical of the power of the state because he understood state ultimately is an instrument of violence. Yes, we need state, and as Mohandas pointed out, but we need to minimize the use of violence, and therefore we have to minimize the use of the state in human affair. And Gandhi was very clear about that. So to me, Gandhi represents quite eloquently the idea of political freedom. Rajaji, Rajgopalachari, right, other stalwart of the freedom movement, to me represents economic freedom. He championed through Swatantra Party and many other ways the economic freedom of Indians. And I think quite often he talked about that we got independence from the British Raj, but we are still fighting for our freedom, right? Often it was called also second freedom struggle. So first freedom was from the British Raj. Second freedom, of course, is also from the Indian state for the citizens of India. And Rajaji actually represented that idea of economic freedom quite eloquently. Third person, Rabindranath Tagore, who I think represents a personal freedom, right? He believed, in this case, disagreed with Gandhi, right? That I want freedom to be able to go anywhere, believe in any values that come across, right? So I think Tagore represents that personal freedom of a liberal. So if you combine the sort of ideas of Gandhi, Rajaji, and Tagore, you actually find a great rearticulation, or you can say Indian articulation of liberalism. And I think that's really a good way to think about what liberal means in the Indian context.
I was going to make a point,
Sure, yeah.
since we are on the subject of defining things, to spend 2 minutes on how liberalism came about. And essentially, it was really some philosophers in the 18th century, late 17th, early 18th century, who realized that the values of what we call liberalism, liberty, equality, the rule of law, and so on, that they expressed those values and they were able to convert those values into what happened in the French Revolution, in 1790, with the American Revolution around the same time, but just before that in England, in what the British called the Glorious Revolution. All these three revolutions resulted in democracy and the rule of law becoming to the fore. And frankly, since then, now it's all 250 years, liberalism has been the reigning ideology of the world. Now that's quite a record. And each country has put a little spin on it. India, of course, uh, first had its first struck with this modern idea of liberalism on the in the it came with the coattails on the coattails of the British Raj. But Indians being Indians, they put a spin on this idea. And what was that spin? This is both from Rammohn Roy onwards, whether it was Gandhi or Vivekananda or Aurobindo or number of thinkers who made our modern state possible. These thinkers also added the notion of inner freedom, not only freedom from the power outside, freedom from, but also freedom from inside. And we can talk a little bit later about that. But what I wanted to say is that country after country turned democratic, but also country uh, after country underlined the economic freedom based on the market. And here again, those thinkers like Adam Smith played a very important role in defining economic freedom. So, the reality is that as a reigning ideology in the world, liberalism has fought some pretty formidable enemies and defeated them. One, it defeated fascism in the Second World War. It defeated communism in the second half of the 20th century. And today that liberalism is in trouble. But what I say is that it's such a good idea. I don't think it's going to be put down by the difficulties that today, there are books coming out these days, The Death of Liberalism and so on. Yes, it has weakened, but it's not going to stay down for too long, especially when you have defeated far more serious enemies than what we have today. So I wanted to add that point, the historical view of it, which I think gives it a sort of a place. But the point that I think Mohandas made is that and what I really fundamentally believe in, this notion which Gandhi and others injected with the notion of inner freedom, which really goes right back to the Vedas and the Upanishads, especially. In fact, the first, the most powerful rendering of that idea came in a skeptical verse in the Rig Veda, 1500 BC. And it was what's famously called the Nasadiya Shukta, Nasadiya in chapter 10, where they're debating how was the cosmos created. And well, they ask ourselves, well, it was dark, there was no being. How would we know? Oh, maybe we should ask the gods. But then somebody tells them, no, the gods came afterwards. How would they know? And then they say, well, maybe we should ask the Brahmins. Oh, no. The Brahmins are always arguing with each other. we'll just get more and more confused. So they dismiss that. And then they go back and forth like this, and they conclude. The major conclusion is a great liberal statement. And the holiest text of the country says, well, the conclusion is maybe we don't know. Now, that is a liberal statement when you admit that maybe we don't know. And that idea then gets injected into the Upanishads soon after the Vedas, where the whole principle of argument is neti, 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 and through neti, neti, which is again a liberal exercise. And then when we get our personal gods, um, I mean, and now we have 330 million. They tell us 330 million gods. In a country of 330 million gods, no god can afford to feel jealous. Now, that is a liberal idea where no god can, and an average Indian in a village will tell you, well, yeah, we have 33 crore gods, but only one god. An apparent an apparent contradiction. But they understand that all these gods are mainly symbols of one God. And I mean, what I'm trying to suggest is whether it's the mental experiments of the Upanishads or in the profusion of plurality in so many ways in our country, this is what makes the temper of the country liberal. And that adds to my confidence that it won't be put down very easily, even though it may have weakened in recent years.
No, I want to just add to what Gurcharan says and also differ. Liberalism is not a Western idea alone. To say that liberalism rose after the in the Renaissance, after the age of enlightenment, when philosophers wrote, it's not necessarily the right thing to say that is a Western construct and we learn from the West. I think every culture, every long-standing civilization will see an evolution, and they'll have elements of liberalism in what they do, and evidence of dogma. Dogma is a means of control to bring in uniformity, to supposedly rule for the greater common good. Dogma is the power structure. And how we challenge dogma and fight against dogma is the story of liberalism. In the European context, liberal societies led to colonization, to slavery. The Americans thought themselves to be very liberal. Every man is born, we believe that every man is born free, they said, but not the blacks. They made slaves out of the blacks. They sold them, they brutalized them, they killed them. The British colonized the whole world, exploited the citizens, starved them out, took away the money, killed them, butchered them, shot them with machine guns all over. The French did that. The other Europeans did it. Then all the liberal societies fought among themselves in great wars. Now, liberalism for them was a nationalistic construct for their own society, not for others. For true liberalism to flourish, it has to be a universal construct. It has to be a civilizational construct which believes that the entire world is one single family, that we are all humans on this planet and we are all equal to each other. And that kind of a civilizational construct is what will carry true liberalism outside. Otherwise, it will be my liberal ideas versus your liberal ideas. Like the conflict in the United States right now with all these wokes who believe they are the progressives, they are very liberal, everybody else is a fascist. And for them, extreme liberalism means the right to shut out others, right to cancel, right to prevent everybody from expressing their views. And anybody who disagrees is a fascist, a non-progressive, and to promote anarchy. I think we have got to think about this concept in the future very clearly and try to create a social context which accepts the inalienable right of every human being on this planet to live a life of dignity and freedom. The inalienable right of every individual on this planet to have the right to make a choice. And of course, we live in a political economy where every country has a boundary. You can't allow people to come into your country freely. It's impossible. It's very difficult. But we must work together in global institutions to solve the global problem without conflict, without any destruction of others' property. And that is the future evolution that has to happen. So I think true liberalism will be the real freedom to say no, the freedom to question anything, including religion, the freedom to question the existence of God himself, which is not available to the great majority of humanity, because that's the ultimate freedom, to say no God exists and live in a pluralistic religious society where you are accepted and you're right to say no God exists or to oppose God himself or herself or whoever that person or whatever the entity is protected. And I think that evolution, but to me, liberalism is a journey, not perfect. All the same, a work in progress for every country, many of them based upon philosophy or political doctrine, many of them based upon civilizational construct, many of them based upon religion, and many of them just based upon multiple things and thought. Was the Buddha a liberal? The Buddha was a true liberal because the Buddha was against dogma. Was Confucius a liberal? Yes, he was liberal in many ways, but he believed in piety, believed in duty, etc. And sometimes that gave open to a centralized power. So I think it's a very different concept, very difficult concept to understand, because we understand concept of hierarchy, we understand concept of order, we understand concept of a ruler, because it comes easily. We want a perfect society where there is no discordant voices, where everybody lives happily, where everybody has everything that they want, and is ultimately brought about by a benevolent dictator or a benevolent ruler. There's no benevolent dictator. There's no benevolent ruler. There's no benevolent political philosophy except individual freedom and individual choice. It's a very difficult concept, but that's the true hallmark of a good society.
Sorry, guys, I got cut off by a power switch. But Mohan, hearing you talk reminded me of something my son introduced me many years ago, to the horseshoe effect. And he said the extreme left and the extreme right are actually not on different parts of a continuum. They're actually like a horseshoe. Both are as illiberal as each other and resemble each other so much in a way.
Louis, I just wanted to add something to what Mohandas Pai just said. I agree fundamentally with all the things you said, Mohandas, but I wanted to say that, it is true that liberalism in the West, as we know it, rose during a period of imperialism, during a period of slavery. All these things are correct. But what was wrong with these things? What was wrong was imperialism and slavery, and not liberalism. Liberalism actually destroyed the feudal order economically to give rise to a much more free market-based order. It destroyed the monarchical rule of countries and led to democracies, to a point where, so that movement in the modern times of the last 200 years is an ideology that has fought in the world. I'm not suggesting that it's not a universal construct. I agree with you that Buddha was liberal a long time ago, and there were elements of liberalism in all civilizations. So I just thought that to give some historical construct to this might be helpful.
Gurcharan, Louis, let me take it up with Gurcharan, because he made a very interesting point, and I want to ask him a question. Gurcharan, do you think that economic liberalism is a prerequisite for true liberalism? Because I remember a big event in Bangalore, where there was a book release, Samaj Aur Bazaar, by Rohini Nilekani.
Oh.
And, you know, it was Samaj and Bazaar, and how the Bazaar came up. And many people said the Bazaar must be controlled by Samaj. I want to stand up and say, Samaj has prospered because of the Bazaar. Is the rise of economic liberalism and trade that liberalized society and gave people the rights. At one point of time, there was a feudal order ruled by kings and lords, and the rest were serfs because the source of wealth was the land. Land was tilled. Then came the merchants who traded all around the world and took goods and services from all around to distribute and made a lot of money. The rise of the merchant class, the rise of the bazaar created wealth for society, created, you know, a larger number of people who could move away from the land to where they were tied to the urban areas and the cities, where because of specialization, they flourished. And as the, you know, market became much more powerful, and when people became much more wealthier, they started agitating for their rights, because to enjoy the wealth, they needed to have the freedom that they wanted, and they saw themselves as greater freedom beings. And they had the time and the ability to look at other issues apart from survival. And with the rise of the market, rise of trade, rise of the economy, and the creation of wealth that destroyed the feudal order. And the feudal order blew up in the second two great wars, when the imperialistic order, and the feudal order was at conflict with the rise of the global economy and greater freedom amongst people, and led to this great conflict. So I think, Gurcharan, economic liberalism is a necessary prerequisite for a fully liberal order. Because without economic liberalism, people don't have the right of choice. How can
I agree with you, Mohan. I agree with you. In fact, the origin of all this goes back when the first exchange took place in history. And that was after the agricultural. You know, we were hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years. And then suddenly we invented agriculture. And with agriculture came surplus. And when there was surplus, somebody had something extra, which he did not need. And so he stood in what we would today became the market. It was like a post. I'm standing there with my extra beans that I have made, and I'm ready to barter with you with whatever extra you've got. Anyway, the bazaar is really, and that became the bazaar. So the bazaar is really the beginning of it all. And so that's why I was saying that why it's so relevant in India, because for the first 40 years of our history as an independent country, we denied our people economic freedom. And I sometimes even say that we didn't get our freedom in 1947. We really got our true freedom in 1991. And because that really, if you don't have economic freedom, in fact, the damage was much greater, because we sacrificed 2 generations of our people to the sacrificed opportunities for 2 generations of young people. And when I tell our young people today how lucky they are, they're bitching around about this or that. I said, if you had to face what we had to face, what certainly I had to face when I, had to work during the license ride, it was pretty bad.
Okay, so I'm going to actually come back to Gurcharan, put that on pause, because there's a trend that I want to explore with you. But before that part, you talked about the fact that liberalism is about non-violence. Today, we're seeing a lot of leaders encouraging violence across the world, saying you should fight for your rights and you should do this. Are we seeing a challenge to democracy and liberalism, and a desire to go back to a order where you had powerful leaders who
curtail rights? Do you see that as a concern today?
I think that's really a very good question. I think we have to ask if liberalism is universal, it is about choice and freedom, then why is it so difficult to sell the idea to the larger public, right? So why do we see liberalism not really rising up and not being the natural sort of acceptance by the larger public? I think that really requires some understanding of, I think, what Mohandas Pai mentioned about order. So people want an orderly society, and usually they assume that to have an order, you need an orderer, somebody who designs the order and enforces the order, right? While in the liberal conception of order, it is what we refer to as spontaneous order, or what Adam Smith referred to as invisible hand, right? And it's not easy to see, obviously, it's invisible hand. So it's not easy to see what that hand does, right? And therefore, I think there's a huge sort of distinction between how the order gets formed. And unless people understand that part of it, it's very difficult to be liberal generally. So even though as an individual, I may be very liberal because I believe in my freedom, my choice, right? And therefore, I'm liberal in that sense. But being a liberal at a social level, at a political level is very different because I want society to be orderly society, whichever way I define my order. And therefore, I think that somebody has to use the danda. And without the use of danda, without the use of violence in some sense, you cannot have an order, right? So I think to understand the working of spontaneous order, the working of invisible hand, right, is required some amount of thinking, right? Some amount of exposure in a way to how the world works. And I think unless we are able to provide that kind of understanding, even though it's very common sense, so once you understand, it seems very commonsensical, right? Oh, yes, of course, this is how the world works, is very obvious. But unless you are exposed to that way of thinking, at least given that spark of thinking about spontaneous order, is very difficult to then believe that you can have orderly society or orderly market, right, or bazaar without having someone with a danda on the top, right? And I think that's really where I see the key challenge for liberalism. How do you explain that idea of spontaneous order in a way so that everybody understands that across the society?
You know, Louis, I want to add to that. The important thing in a liberal society is self-constraint, is judicial discretion, like they say, judicial constraint. We have to have self-constraint on absolute rights. It's not political correctness, but self-constraint. Because in a society, there has to be a balance of power. Because our society is necessarily to be orderly, divided into various bits, the executive, the judiciary, and the lawmakers. And each one has to exercise constraint and restraint as stated in the Constitution, because once you start encroaching upon something, then that leads to a one-way street where tyranny could rule, because there's no balance of power. There has to be balance everywhere, the yin and the yang, like the Chinese say. And like we say in the rule of dharma. Now just look at the Mahabharata. Why did the Mahabharata begin? I mean, it started because the Pandavas were dispossessed. They asked for 5 villages for them. And then Duryodhana refused. I won't give you 1 inch of land. And then started all this discussion, and it ended up in a big fight, a Mahabharata, a big battle, right? The battle to establish dharma again. What was his dharma? His dharma as a ruler was to accommodate everybody, take care of everybody to the best extent possible. And that means you have to be generous. Liberalism means you have to be generous to the other. You cannot be somebody who shuts out others in intellectual arrogance, to think that you have the perfect answer to every. You are a liberal because why? You call yourself a liberal. You have a perfect answer to every problem. And anybody who does not agree with your perfect answer should be shut up. Like it happens in academic circles today, where they had to shut up multiple voices of reason. Listen to multiple voices. Then, like Gurcharan said earlier too, you choose the best option. Because the liberal is one who has got a self-correcting mechanism, who does not believe always that whatever views they hold is the ultimate view, because they're not gods. We're not born with infinite wisdom. I don't think God also has infinite wisdom, what is right or wrong, till they go through that. And that is what our civilization teaches us. And it's very important to have self-restraint, to learn and to understand and to appreciate and balance everybody's interest, because in life, there's no perfect solution. There's no perfect solution. If you're a parent and you've got more children, how do you divide your property? How do you spend time with everybody? There is no perfect solution. Like in the Mahabharata, when Krishna goes and says, you can have my army, you can have me. The Adharma chooses the army because they believe that's the only power by which to rule. Whereas the Dharma part of it chooses Krishna because it says you are the epitome of Dharma, and Dharma can only prevail when we go on your path, and with you we can fight Adharma. Because Adharma is not power. Adharma is power, and we got to fight it. Dharma is moral power, is moral suasion, is standing up, the courage, like Gandhiji imbibed in the Indians. Just imagine, here is a half-naked man, poor man with no assets, nothing except moral courage, who tells the great, unwashed, poor, beaten, defeated people of this country, who don't have 2 rotis to eat, to stand up and fight against the greatest power the world has ever seen. And when they raise a stick to beat you, don't raise your hand. Don't fight back. That is moral courage. How did the courage come in these people? Because these people believed in Dharma. There is no parallel in human history for people who protested against tyranny, against violence, who did not hit back, who did not resort to violence, to fight violence, but who stood there and said, do your best, do your worst. And so many of them gave their lives. They've beaten black and blue, but they never raised their hand. And that is true liberalism. They died for a cause. But see, that is the power. And where did the power come from? The power comes from self-restraint, believing in principles, believing in the right of others, believing in a just society, and believe that everybody has a right to existence. You alone do not have the right. Everybody has a right to do their choices, and we can all differ, but we have to live in peace. So I think self-restraint is important. In India, the biggest challenge we have is the lack of self-restraint in our 3 institutions. Parliament encroaching upon the liberty of citizens by passing laws like the new tax bill, which wants to go and you go into all your social media and extort things from you. And it's like the Supreme Court saying, we are supreme and you shall have no view. What we say is the law. I am the law, and what we say is the law. And not exercising self-restraint in many areas, and a judgment about the president, and executing, doing whatever it wants, enforcing law in a very partial manner in many cases, using the instrumentalities of the state for the political objectives, etc. Now, there needs to be a balance of power, and the root of it is the individual. Individuals, all of us, have to express ourselves, and moral suasion is required. Yeah, we can have political violence, we can have resort to violence, but that is going to lead to further violence, and it cannot create a kind of society. So liberalism is individualistic, is societal, it is social, it is economic, it is political. It's very, very difficult thing for people to understand. But innately, we are animals who believe in power. We want to exercise power. We are the alpha male, the alpha female who want to exercise power every day. I want to prove to you, Louis, I'm smarter than you, I'm bigger than you, I'm richer than you, I'm more powerful than you. That's the innate need. How do we, like Gurcharan said, through our inner expression, overcome that? That is our history. That is our philosophy. How do you overcome our innate, brutal emotions to be truly liberal?
So it's interesting, Gurcharan.
Louis, sorry, I just to add one thing more to what Parth just said and what Mohan Pai said. It's not intuitive actually. To understand the market. Parth was saying it's very difficult because the invisible hand is invisible, and the reality is it is in fact one of the most difficult things to understand. That, as was what Adam Smith was saying, that really here are millions of people working for their own self-interest, but in the end, it lifts the whole society up. Now, that's not an intuitive idea, and therefore, one of the failures in our country. And what actually also, it's not intuitive, the notion of balance of power, that how you need a separate judiciary, separate legislature, separate executive to be a check on each other. It's not an intuitive idea. So I guess the biggest failure that I feel in our country is that we have not sold the market, and we have not either sold this notion of balance of power and the need for restraint that Mohandas Pai was talking about. And why haven't we done it? I mean, it's really, in England, we know that Margaret Thatcher, probably the biggest thing she did, she used to say, I spend 20% of my time doing the reforms and 80% of the time selling the reforms. What she was doing was selling the market. Similarly, in China, Deng Xiaoping didn't have to sell anything to anybody. He was a dictator. But he would talk about all the time, from right through in the 1980s, talk about how the market works. And so one is, you need to talk market. And it's our tragedy that Mahatma Gandhi died so soon after independence, because he was the one person who was able to translate the ideas of liberty and equality, the liberal ideas, into the language of Sadharan Dharma. And he was able to capture the masses. They understood. When Nehru tried after independence, but he was too much of a Western-oriented gentleman who could not reach the people in the same way. And of course, partly our failure, our problem is because of the language. I mean, today, the rise of Hindutva, etc., is partly a resentment against a small elite, English-speaking elite, which has ruled the country for the last 75, 80 years. And the fact of the matter is that only about 10 to 15% of the people in India understand English, when all the serious decisions in the private sector or in the public sector are discussed in English. And if a bright young person walked in, even in this podcast, they were listening, they would feel deaf. And to feel deaf in your own country after 75 years of independence, I mean, that's pretty sad. So one can understand some of why liberalism is to some extent in bad repute, because nobody has done the job of selling it. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, Mr. Gurcharan, the point I was getting up is, we've all grown up, as we've just talked about, in this era of socialism, etc. Gandhi had died before we were born, etc. Maybe we could just sort of spend some time talking about how did we confirm to ourselves that we were a true liberal? How did we see the light? To me, it happened when I was in Chicago and, exposed to people like Friedman, Stigler, Gary Becker, etc., and saw the light over there. Why don't you start, Gurcharan, and tell us, when did you see the light?
Well, I began to see the light when I studied philosophy at Harvard. But really, the big moment for me was when I started working. Like everyone else, I was a socialist at that time. This was Nehru's age of hope. My parents were socialists. I was a socialist. And I began working for a company that made Vicks Vapor Rub. And one year there was a flu, and we sold a hell of a lot of Vicks Vapor Rub. And we were, celebrating what a good job we had done during an epidemic. running factory 3 shifts and keeping the store shelves stocked with Vicks during the epidemic. And just then, I got a summons from Delhi. And the summons said that we had broken the law. And what law had we broken? We had broken the law of licensing, which said that you could make only so many tons of Vicks Vapor Rub in 1 year. And we had exceeded that by 30%. And so, and there was my lawyers told me that there was a 3-year jail sentence, maximum 3 years, for breaking this law, although it was at the discretion of the government. And so I arrived in Delhi, where I was treated like a criminal by this joint secretary. I and 2 lawyers, we were waiting for him for 2 hours. Then he called us into his office. He was reading the Times of India that day. And while we kept waiting for him, he kept reading the paper. And we were too polite to go to remind him that we were waiting for him. Finally, he put the paper down, newspaper down, and he says, "Kya?" And I said, "Kya, saab? Aap bataiye. Kya? Why have you're the one who's called us." And he says, "No, tell me, what is it all about?" And I showed him the summons. And he said, "So you broke the law?" And I said, "Yes, but we did so much good. We produced for the country during an epidemic, and we brought comfort to millions of homes during this epidemic. And frankly, we did our duty to keep the stores stocked with Vicks." And he said, "But you broke the law." I said, "Yes, but." He says, "No, but. Tell me yes or no. Did you break the law?" I said, "Well, yes." And he says, he wrote down, confesses that he broke the law. And then he said that, "Look, you chaps in the private sector, you think you're great, and I want to make an example of your company. You're a multinational company, and you know the background of our country, how a multinational company called East India Company exploited us. And I want to send a message to all the companies in India that they have to obey the law, that you can't just get away with breaking our laws, no matter how great you think you are from abroad." Anyway, so he says, "Jao." And I was by then shivering. And as we went out of his office at the door, exit, I turned around and I said, "Sir, you know that this news will get out. It's not every day that an executive of a multinational company has to go to jail. And people will read all over the world, whether in London Times or New York Times, that here was a company that was produced for the sake of the country, for the good of the country, during an epidemic, and did so much good. And what will they think of our laws? What will they think of our country when they read this, that you rewarded them with sending the executive to jail?" He said, "Are you threatening me?" I said, "No, I'm not threatening you. I'm just telling you this is what will happen." And he says, "Jao." When we came out of the doors, the lawyers got angry with me, and they said, "You should have fallen on your knees and begged for mercy." And there you were, in your high horse, with your high moral ground. And anyway, all I can say is that I had a number of sleepless nights, and the government quietly dropped the inquiry, the whole case. Somebody must have seen the light. But the next week, I joined the Swatantra Party.
Oh,
And I can say that that was my conversion. I was a socialist who became a liberal. And it was precisely the idiotic lunacy of the license Raj that drove me to this. And Louis, you asked me, and maybe I don't want to take more time.
Go ahead, go ahead,
I have one more story, which
please.
is that how I how as this change to becoming a liberal, how I confirmed myself one day that I had become a true liberal. And this happened in Chennai. At that time, it was still called Madras. And there's a wonderful, I had a few hours, I went there for work. I had a few hours to kill after my meeting, before my flight. And I went to see the Chola bronzes in the Great Madras Museum. And as I was admiring the first great piece at the entrance, which is a Tandav dancing Nataraja, the Chola bronze of the Shiva Nataraja dancing the Tandav dance, creating the world. And I was admiring the lightness of touch and the beauty, the wonder of the sculptor who had been able to capture the beautiful lightness of the movement of the god. And as I was just going aside, a woman, a Tamil woman, barefoot, she came and she put a vermilion mark on the god. And I was outraged. The liberal in me said, my God, doesn't she realize this is a museum? It's not a temple. What is she doing? Anyway, I moved on. And then I noticed the other beautiful sculptures, admired a few, then got a bit irritated because there was dust on one of the other statues of, I think, of Vishnu. And then another sculpture was not very well lit. So my niggling, liberal, English-speaking mind was going through all this. And I came back to the Tandav. After seeing this, I came back to the main sculpture in the front, which I had been. And the woman, she was still there. And this time, there was also a little marigold flower on its feet. And I had a very different reaction. Instead of that sort of outrage in the beginning, I said to myself, now look at the contrast between me and her. I have this, my world is a pale reflection of hers. She's seeing the universe being born through the infinite dance of this God. And I'm looking at the sculpture, worrying about the lighting in the museum or the dust on a thing. And suddenly I felt ashamed. And I said, look at this. She's the one who truly understands what this is all about. And I couldn't help. Now I'm an atheist or an agnostic. And suddenly I felt, and I'm not a believer. Here was a believer. And what I'm saying here is, to me, what that moment was to affirm my own liberalism, that I could see somebody with the opposite belief of mine and admire her for her belief, instead of getting into an argument about atheism and versus theism. And in a way, it's also a tribute to our culture, because in India, as I think Mohandas Pai said earlier, that in India, you can be a respectable Hindu and still be an atheist. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about our pluralism. And I just thought I'd tell you those two stories because they meant so much in my life.
Thank you, Gurcharan. Mohan, we were around the same age, and Infosys has all these stories about how they struggle getting computers in the old days and stuff like that. How did you sort of become a liberal?
Well, I think it was my college days when we are in the midst of the emergency. We are growing up. That's the only world we knew. We thought an emergency came. The trains ran on time. The cost of idli dosa vada came down. And we were happy. And suddenly, when you got a daily newspaper, it didn't come on some days. The editorial was blank. We heard of people getting arrested, thrown into jail, and there's an element of fear. And that's the time when we understood the value of freedom, the rights of individuals in a very fundamental way, not in a very sophisticated way. Then as I grew up in a very controlled economy, we thought what the government did in license quota Raj was the right thing to do. That's the way. We didn't know anything else. And that's the way we grew up. And there's a very quiet world till 1991 happened. And 94, I joined Infosys, and we enjoyed the benefits of a true economic liberalization when we had great freedom, the freedom to lace, the freedom to import, the freedom to travel. And that's how it hit me personally, that we are not enjoyed this economic rights so far, even though the Constitution said this. And I did my law. I read the Constitution. I read my law. I read Lord Denning's works of how the rule of law is paramount to every individual. And the law has to be interpreted in a manner to promote individual rights and individual freedom. And the majesty of the law, how the law is above everybody. Be you ever so high, the law is above you. And that gave a spirit of equality, and that gave an element of exhilaration that you're free. And I think that was very important. And I think that's what made me understand the economic part of it. And then on the social sphere, I understood what true liberalism is. When I went around the country and met a lot of people, and I was able to, go through. But then I was told that India is a caste society. People have been oppressed by the so-called upper caste and all that. And I was wondering, where is the oppression? I don't see the oppression in society. We move around. I never faced any caste thing. I faced racism when I traveled out. I faced racism in the US. I faced it in Germany. I faced it in New Zealand, of all places, and felt inadequate. But in my country, I never faced anything, even though I felt discriminated because of reservation, but understood the logic for reservation. So I think it's an evolution over time. And I'll tell you a story which somebody told me. A person very close to me, a great entrepreneur, used to oppose Murli Manohar Joshi's diktat on education, and he used to be a vocal opponent. Then after the government change, I asked him what happened. Why do not standing up for academic freedom? He said, Mohan, in that with Murli Manohar Joshi is highly educated. I know oppose him. There'll be no retribution and there'll be no oppression. Now if I stand up and talk, they'll go after me and they'll destroy me. They know how to do it. Exercise of power. You understand? All this teaches you. Because, like Gurcharan said, you have to go through a catharsis to understand how you are at risk. It's only when your life is at risk, because the environment becomes oppressive, then you understand what true liberalism is. If the economic condition was liberal in this country, Gurcharan will never have to go face a government servant and get abused and be treated shabbily, wait outside for 2 hours and be ill-treated, to understand and to understand fear and experienced fear about something for which he felt that he was doing great service, right? That's why, Louis, I write on tax terrorism. Repeat, today also I wrote an article on tax terrorism, how the new tax bill is an affront to liberal values, is an affront to our constitutional rights, an affront to our right to privacy, and how we need judicial safeguards. And people tell me, aren't you scared of government? Aren't you scared of everybody? And I tell them, because you write so much, I tell them, look, I respect this government, I respect our Prime Minister, has done great work, but I believe that as a citizen, I must express my opinion as a member of a free society on things when I feel the government is going wrong. Because our representatives are our representatives, not our maliks. They're not our owners. They're not our masters. They're our representatives. They must talk to us, allow us to express their views and convey our views in Parliament, the ultimate place where laws are made. So I think it's only when your life gets threatened, you understand the value of rule of law, the protection of the state, and all that. Till then, you don't understand it. You are in hubris, you enjoy the access to power, you enjoy patronage, you enjoy being part of a closed circuit. It's like the people in Lutyens, Delhi, right? Lutyens, Delhi were used to being close to power for so long. They got favors, they enjoyed the spoils of office, they enjoyed the spoils of being a small number of people. And that's why I say, in 1950, one set of white imperialists left and the new set of brown imperialists took over. Our lives did not change. We are as oppressed as ever. We had some freedom, but we didn't have economic freedom. We didn't have full freedom, right? And hits you when you become a victim. It only lack of freedom hits you when you got a victim. Till then, you don't understand the value. And now that we have grown up and we do understand values, because we face that, we must express ourselves whenever we see signs of the government overreach, even the courts overreaching sometimes in multiple areas, and the court not standing up for liberal values, the court tilting to some side without taking stands. Louis, one of the big things that agitate my mind, and I want to talk about it here, is that our Constitution 1950 says that we build that liberty, equality is guaranteed to everybody irrespective of gender. Yet 50% of population women were oppressed for long because of unequal rights. Then we had the Hindu Code Bill and the Hindu Maintenance Act, Hindu Marriage Act, etc., where the Hindu community were liberalized, except that girls could not enjoy the right to ancestral co-partitionary property, which the Supreme Court then intervened 15, 20 years ago to give them equal rights. Because equal rights for women are the biggest drawback in any society, because we live in a society where men dominate, right? And women are 50% of population. And today, even though we have Article 14 and Article 19 talking about equality and the right to life, Muslim women don't enjoy equal rights. And it's shocking to me how 8% of India's population cannot equal rights, where for 75 years the Constitution guaranteed equal rights irrespective of gender. And if you read the Sabrimala decision, it says very clearly by Justice Chandrachud, where Article 14 and 19 is in conflict with 25, 26, right to religion, 14 and 19 shall prevail. Because in our democracy, in our constitution, equality is the most important attribute, and no religious law, no other law which brings in inequality shall prevail. Except in the realm of religion, one part of our society still remain oppressed. And I don't see many debates. I don't see any of the so-called liberals talking about this kind of injustice. Why cannot all women enjoy equal rights like men, the 50% of population? That should be the priority for us as a society. And how can it be called as a liberal democratic society unless at least on paper everybody enjoys equal rights? So I think all this make you feel that the key thing, Louis. I asked myself, where am I safest? I got one life, only one life. The thing, and life is fragile. Life is very fragile, and after we go, there's nothing else left. You don't exist. You got one life. And life is fragile. How do you protect the biggest asset, your life? And where is it protected? Not in a benevolent dictatorship. Everybody says, we need dictatorship. We need a benevolent dictator who will come and have order, who will make sure everything works. There is no corruption. There is no record of a benevolent dictator any time in human history. It's only dictatorship, the rule of one man against everybody else. But liberalism is chaotic. Liberalism is difficult to understand, difficult to enjoy. It's got various facets. You don't know the line where illiberalism and liberalism join together, where the line is, because you have to go through the experience, you have to go through it. But we have to strive for it because it is very, very fundamental to existence. So when you go through some issues like that and see what is happening, you understand that liberalism is the only solution to a good society, and to have a good orderly society where you can grow and realize a dream. The children can do that, where you can all be safe. And our constitution is liberal, but we have to create a liberal society. Society has to be more liberal, and that is the question of education, interaction, debate, and understanding.
So it's interesting. We're talking about the constitution and the values. And today, as the day we're recording all of this, is Ambedkar's birthday. So it's an interesting sort of coincidence over here that we're discussing this great man and the work that he did in creating this. You talked about benevolent dictator doesn't exist. It reminded me of this book that we must have all read when we were kids, Animal Farm. And about all pigs are equal, but some pigs are more equal than others, and that's what happens again with benevolent dictators. They stop being benevolent. But Parth, how did a pharmacy student become a liberal?
I think, like many others, like Gurcharan particularly, I also came to liberalism from philosophical point of view. So in my college summer break, a classmate of mine gave me books by Ayn Rand, and he had a whole collection of Rand's books, fiction and non-fiction. And during that summer, I read through all of them, which led me to read Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek's Road to Serfdom. And suddenly, over that one summer, my thinking, I don't know whether I was consciously socialist or Marxist before. It being in the science stream, those things were not very important part of my life at that point. But I certainly came across these ideas. And then I begin to see, as many people pointed out, some life experience that really sort of highlights the difference and importance of these ideas. So in Gujarat, where I was going through college, every day on the back page of Gujarat Samachar, the newspaper there, you will see either a story of few people, sometimes large number of people dying because of the consumption of spurious alcohol. It's a dry state, so many people used to consume illicit liquor, and of course, many died. And you keep saying this story often with sort of graphic photographs in newspaper every day. And you wonder, why is that, right? Why is it in a society so many people are dying every day and nothing seems to be happening? And slowly, I think that leads you to think about how the system of governance works, what's the rule of law, what's about the freedom, right? And some of those ideas begin to sort of intertwine. So I think that was one important part of my experience, both sort of philosophical exposure to these ideas through the works of Rand and Friedman and Hayek, and of course the experience of living in India. I think particularly the chapter in Hayek's Road to Serfdom, right? Where he talks about why the worst get to the top. So basically talks about why in a system which has a lot of government controls, the worst kind of people are going to rise to the top. And you see the same thing happening in India. And that what got me attracted to economics, that this person writing in 1945, more than 40, 50 years ago, could actually predict what kind of society would emerge if you have such and such arrangement, right? And that I found far more fascinating subject, and which made me change my field from pharmacy to economics. So all of that happened in some sense during that once year or so of my college.
Sure. It's been an interesting conversation. We've been going on for about 90 minutes, and it's actually great to see. Yeah, I'm going to come back. Come back to you. But it's interesting to see, all three of you guys have actually played a role in my life. Mohan was the one who, way back in '99, when I met him to pitch to him for business, actually was responsible for me moving out of the banking world into the private equity world, and that sort of created a new journey for me. That's when I met up with Gurcharan when he was an advisor at Chris Capital. And that's my first sort of introduction to the world of venture capital and private equity. And then after many years later, when I got to maybe 12, 10 years later, I met up with Parth, and that created a whole new journey on policy. And in my whole sort of life, as hearing this sort of last 90 minutes, my life was also reliving my own experiences in my liberal journey. But Gurcharan, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. So I'm saying that, I mean, it's been very nice listening to Parth and Mohandas Pai. And the question that I think a listener of this podcast would be asking is, well, why are there no liberals in any, why is there no political party which is liberal? Um, and so the way I mean, Swatantra Party died during the Indira wave of the 1970s, as did many other parties. And I've asked myself this question, and it's very apparent to me that if I decided to stand for election as a liberal, classical liberal, and the person who was standing against me, I would promise to the constituency, to the voter, I would create conditions for investment, and there'd be factories, and there would be jobs, and I would invest in education so people could be better skilled, and so on. And my opponent today would promise free electricity from the day he got elected. He would promise uh, 1 lakh of rupees per family. He would promise pocket money for all the women. As you know, all these are things that's what all that politicians today promise. And who do you think will get elected? Of course, the person who's promising immediate gratification, he knows, you know what he'll say? Oh, Gurcharan Das, by the time all these things happen, his schools improve and his factories come up, by then he'll be gone. So I'd rather go for the guy who's giving me free electricity from tomorrow. I mean, it's a very rational choice. This is of the voter. And so it makes you realize how very difficult, is this message. And particularly when we have not had a Margaret Thatcher or a Deng Xiaoping or anyone like that. In fact, you know, soon after Mr. Modi came to power, about a year later, he invited some of us who write on the economy to his house, and he asked us, "What should I be doing?" And that was a very nice, open question, and I was certainly very impressed by the openness of his mind. And there was Nainan there was Swaminathan Iyer, Surjit Bhalla, Rajiv Kumar, the usual people who write. And I told him to sell the reforms, sell the market. And he asked me, well, give me a one pager on how to sell the market. And so I gave it to him. And in fact, he used it. And one Mann Ki Baat, he actually spent time explaining this. What occurred to me was that this was now, 10 years ago. But you can't just do it once, you need to keep after it. And so what we do need is that, and where I feel most let down is right from the time of Manmohan Singh down and Vajpayee and all these people who did great things, but they did not sell the market. They did not sell the reforms. That is one of the unfinished jobs of our country. Just as I said, another unfinished job is to sell the Constitution, because Gandhi died. And after that, I mean, people still think the Constitution fell from the sky one day and it's not theirs. Well, that's again another unfinished agenda of our country.
Luis, I want to focus on one question before we end. Is liberalism a product of a rich society or a poor society? Can a poor society where majority of people are fighting for survival to live a decent life without want be a liberal society? Now, India is a very strange country which created a liberal constitution and tried to...
So, Mohan, can I pause? In relation to this question, I want to add one more point to as you respond. We've talked about self-interest and why self-interest is also at the heart of whatever we do. It's about caring for yourself. So as you look at this question of poor and rich society, can you also look at the fact that if we all are driven by self-interest, how do we convince people that in their self-interest, they need to be liberal? Carry on, sir.
Luis, yes, and that's why I come to this question, then I'll answer a question. You know, in a poor society where the great majority of people are fighting for survival, what becomes important to them? Survival. Yeah. The ability to have the next meal, to have a roof over the head. I think is a very important question to ponder, because we are all liberal romantics. We believe in liberalism, we believe in philosophy. How many people have read any book on philosophy that either Parth or Gurcharan talk about, or get an education which teach you the benefits of philosophy and good thinking? In a very poor, backward-looking, conservative, illiterate society, these principles are not known because people's focus is on survival. People's focus is on the next meal, making sure their children have enough to live. So I think it's very important that people who have benefited from the system, like in India, take the responsibility of ensuring that we create a society where the basic necessities of life are taken care of. And it can be done by working with the state to create the right kind of policies without infringing on economic freedom and individual freedom, and also contributing personally, sacrificing personally to take care of people around you in a very large context. You cannot be rich in a sea of poverty. You cannot stay in a great mansion when you're surrounded by slums all around and children who are hungry, lying on the street and dying on the street. You cannot do that. So I think that in a liberal society, people at the top have to take the responsibility as leaders of society. And that also means addressing the big important issue. How do we make people believe that current sacrifice will lead to future prosperity? Because the key thing is today, they're fighting for survival. They want to have a decent life, and somebody is offering them the chance of a decent life. And that's why politically, it is a balance between tomorrow and today. And that's the balance the political leaders have tried to make throughout. All our prime ministers and political parties have always tried to address the issue of poverty and want, except that in the last 15 years, last 10 years, our prime minister has been the most successful in doing so because he's executed massive programs on the ground where most Indians have a roof over the head, water in the tap, power in the switch, a toilet in the house, a gas stove, a bank account, money in the bank, a mobile phone, an internet connection, education for children, food on the table, and health insurance. And that's the kind of society that we all of us to strive to create. That means to push, to make people believe that in long term they're going to benefit, because long term we're all dead, because tomorrow we have to survive. We have to be generous. We have to reach out with them. And the successful among us has to spend more time on society, educate them, talk to them, and talk to them in their own language. Like, what was Nehru's biggest problem? He was a white imperialist in a brown skin. He could not communicate to the people like Gandhi did. Gandhi behaved like them, lived like them, worked like them, traveled like them, and they rallied to his call, right? And today too, in politics in this country, there's always a set up with what we call freebies and growth and what we need for growth. We know clearly that we have to invest in higher education, we have to skill people, and that's the long-term sustainable. But people want immediate gratification because they're suffering and they have to give. And that is why, liberalism is a continuous journey. We did the right thing by adopting a very liberal constitution, but the reality of life was very different. We're living in a conservative, poor, defeated country where people didn't have the basic necessities of life. For a period of time, we have survived, we've grown together, we kept the ideals before us, we have kept the fire of liberty, individual freedom, individual choice burning all the time. We have been to multiple aberrations, we have been through multiple conflicts, but we've never given up on this idea of individual freedom and individual choice. And that's the beauty of India, which you must always respect, imbibe on a young. And we must take on, each one of us, the responsibility of reaching out to people to explain to them and do our best to alleviate current misery or current want, while at the same time educated. I think, Louis, that's the reason why you are now working in the social sector. That's the reason why Gurcharan is doing so many things. I'm doing so many things. Parth is doing so many things, right? We could all be extremely focused on economic well-being. But we said, the larger purpose of a just liberal society is important because we believe in being liberals. We believe in being a liberal society, and that requires great patience. And in society, there are multiple voices. There are multiple voices of people who claim to be liberals, who are fascists, who are totalitarians, who want to control everybody, right? There are multiple voices who want to shut you out. There are multiple mistakes that people make in many areas, the multiple conflicts. We must all try our best to calm it down and make sure that, we bring peace to society. And to me, that's a part of being a liberal.
Thank you. We actually have to thank you, Mohan, for suggesting that we put this discussion together. So thank you for that idea, and to the team at CCS for facilitating this. As you wrap up, maybe each of us could sort of put a few words. And Gurcharan, start off with you, and then we'll go to Parth, and then we'll go to Mohan.
Well,
go ahead, Gurcharan.
I have I'm a little more positive about the future. And this is an answer to what Mohandas Pai was saying just now. I believe today, since 1991, we have come a long way. We have lifted 450 million people out of poverty. Now, this is not as much as China. China has lifted 550 million, but between us, 1 billion human beings have been lifted out of poverty as a result of the liberal economies that the two countries have pursued. And secondly, in other words, the people who are below the absolute poverty line, which the World Bank defines today as $2.15 a day, less than 2% of Indians are today beneath that line. Middle class has grown from 10% to 30% in these last 30 years. Now, that's not as much as China. China middle class is over 50%, almost 60%. So we can, what I'm trying to say is that absolute want has been solved, or is certainly being solved, and one can see that happening. What we lack today is that we may have grown at 6.3% over the last 30 years, but we have not created enough jobs. 45% of our population is still in agriculture. This is double of what agriculture needs. And the main reason why we have failed is because we have not created an industrial revolution yet. We seem to have gone from a green revolution to an IT revolution. And this missing middle of that, what I'm trying to say is that that's the only way, frankly, that we will bring the vast majority of our people to a state of economic ease. And this can be done. in the next 20 years. Maybe we have about 15, 20 years for our demographic dividend to end. We have about 15 years before robotics kills all the AI and robotics kill all the factory jobs. But we still have 15 years. And maybe some will say 10, but it's certainly AI is going to hit the white collar jobs before it hits the factory jobs. So all I'm trying to say is that this country, we have one clear agenda before us, and that is to create an industrial revolution. It can be done. So I would like to end my thing on a positive note. And frankly, liberalism, as I said, is too good an idea. It has been the reigning ideology of the world for 250 years. It's faced much worse enemies than we are facing today. And it too, and besides, the Indian temper is liberal. So I kind of see things on a positive note as I and this discussion.
Thank you. Parth?
Let me end also, as you pointed out, the liberals are skeptical. Liberals are always questioning things. So I think I want to end by highlighting an area that I think we need to focus on to revive liberal sort of society and state across the world. And one area, I think we have done a lot of work in applying rule of law to economics. And as you can see, most of us come from economic background. Most liberals generally have been from that sort of particular field. But we have not applied the similar way the rule of law and what it means to politics. So when it comes to liberal politics, we usually assume that just a democracy is good enough, right? And as we know, democracy comes in many shapes and sizes. And what kind of democracy is the right democracy for a liberal state, for a liberal society? I think that question we still need to ask and answer. And I want to sort of highlight that point, that if you look at political parties in India or anywhere else in the world for that matter, there is very little social control that applies to them. Right? There is little requirement of transparency, disclosure, right, that apply to political parties. Now, political parties are what companies are to an economics, right, to an economy. Political parties are to a democracy. And unless I think we think seriously about political parties, how they operate, how they can be made to operate even democratically, right? So I think some of those issues which are focused on the governance of political structure, which is where I think we have not given as much attention to, where we have left basically politicians saying that, okay, I ultimately got elected by people, so I have all the power to do what I choose to do, right? We don't allow something similar being said by a CEO of a company, just because my consumers bought the product I sold, therefore nobody can question what I'm selling, right? I think we have come a long way in understanding rule of law and economics. We still have to go a long way understanding rule of law and politics and the governance of politics. I see that as a, I think, interesting area of work for liberals.
Thank you, Parth. And Mohan?
No, I'm eternally optimistic in India, Louis, and globally too, because as society becomes economically better, people focus on the bigger things of life, not survival. And the bigger things of life, having a good, high quality, decent life where you can dream and achieve your dreams, requires the creation of a liberal society and is a sine qua non for you to have a good life. And all of us want to have a good life. And the Indian is largely liberal. Indian has always been liberal because as a civilization, we have been very liberal in whatever we do. Yes, there are multiple aberrations in any society, and we too have our aberrations, but their aberrations are not something that cannot be overcome or have not been overcome from time to time. And I think wherever human beings live together, interact together, there'll always be aberrations. But the drive towards liberalism is very evident in this country for a long period of time. And also, it is driven by, like Gurcharan said, especially in India, by the need to have inner liberal value and a liberal life, an inner life to seek the reason for our existence, to understand why we live, and to find our own moksha, our own moksha. I don't want to use the word salvation because we have such beautiful words in our own culture where we seek, because we know that life is a fleeting instance in the long history of this planet. And, we have to make the most of it. So I'm very eternal. But the key thing is, all of us who are benefited from the society, who have done well for themselves, have an obligation to help all others, to have economic sustenance, social equality, and also help them in their political evolution by explaining to them, helping them fiscally, financially, personally, and otherwise, and to demonstrate compassion, and to work with the state to make this a much better society. And as people become more wealthier, they get the necessities of life. It is liberalism that they seek. Even in China today, they seek the creation of a liberal order. Liberal order is the ultimate point of realization for all human beings on this planet. And for that, we must overcome dogma. Dogma is the biggest dogma, political, religious, social. Dogma is the biggest challenge and threat to a liberal order. Dogma. And I think that's important for us to understand and to challenge from time to time. And that's why debates like this, discussions like this are very important. And I wish you people will get college students to debate on realization, on liberalism, and why it's important to be a liberal. Self-sustenance and self-preservation requires you to be a liberal. To be a liberal is not a fancy, a romantic idea. It is real life. If you're not liberal, the greatest threat is to you, not to others. You cannot say, I'm a superior liberal and I am beyond anything that happens in society because I've got access to power. I'm part of Lutyens' Delhi, beyond the reach of the law, beyond the reach of anybody. I'm unique. I'm the elite. Because, it doesn't work. That's not the way society works. If we live in a liberal society, there's the greatest protection to life, liberty, and property. I'm very optimistic. I've seen India grow. I've seen the evolution. I've seen so many people demonstrate liberal ideas in society. But the biggest challenge is dogma, fundamentalism of any kind, totalitarian thinking, fascism, and that all of us should oppose and debate and argue. Thank you.
Thank you, Arful. And as we end, I want to quote an economist who I didn't know existed until I came to the Center for Civil Society, a gentleman called B.R. Shenoy. And he said, a free society is so called because its citizens are free individuals, free in the sense of independence from the arbitrary will of another. And on this note, thank you for spending your time here with us. We look forward to more discussions. I've enjoyed the last 90 minutes. Thank you, Mohan, for suggesting this. Thank you for Gurcharan for always being a big supporter to us at CCS and for being the flag bearer of liberalism. And Parth, well, you're the champion of freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you, Lois. Thank you.